Alors,
Order, please. Colleagues, this is a subcommittee on international human rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, June 5th, 2014, we are in our 32nd meeting. Today, we are televised, and we will continue our study of Eritrea.
the first is Lloyd Lipset, who is appearing, says as an individual, but he's in fact appearing in his role as an expert and as the author of a human rights impact assessment report on the Bisha mine in Eritrea. Also Todd Romain, who is Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility with Nevsun. We did consult members of the committee, and it seemed okay to have the two of them appear side by side. But I assume it's the case, Mr. Lipset, that you will be the lead commenter? Okay.
That's correct.
Perfect. Why don't we begin then? What we'll do is you'll do your opening. Members will ask questions, and the amount of time allocated for each question and answer round will be dictated by how much time remains before we wrap up. So I'll figure out how much to allocate once you've completed your work.
If I could just clarify,
yes.
I had shortened my remarks to give Mr. Romain a very brief moment at the end of my allotted 10 minutes. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yep, you can do that. And of course, I'm hoping that both of you will be willing to answer questions.
Absolutely.
I don't know who they'll go to. That's up to the members to decide.
Yeah. It's most appropriate that Mr. Romain speak to the follow-up rather than me. Okay?
Not a problem. Why don't you begin then, please?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Chair and the members of the subcommittee for their invitation to present my recent work in Eritrea to conduct a human rights impact assessment of the Bisha mine. As I know that the subcommittee has deliberated about the human rights situation in Eritrea, I look forward to the question period to dialogue with you about the findings and recommendations of the report, which Nevsun has published and shared with the subcommittee. In terms of my presentation, I would like to briefly cover the following topics. What are human rights impact assessments? My background in conducting such studies, the approach and methodology used for the Bisha assessment, and a few personal observations related to this study. Given the limited time for the presentation, I propose to leave the detailed findings of my report for the question period, and I think it's most appropriate to let Mr. Romain address Nevsun's plans to follow up on the recommendations included in the report. So what are human rights impact assessments? These human rights impact assessment, HRIAs, are the younger sibling of environmental and social impact assessments. They are new tools that measure the potential and actual impacts of business operations on human rights. In particular, they explicitly reference human rights standards and principles and put an emphasis on the risks to affected stakeholders such as workers and community members rather than on the risks to a company. In the past decade, a number of HRI methodologies have been developed by international organizations, and there are a growing number of examples of HRIAs in the public and private sectors. It is difficult to guess exactly how many HRIAs have been conducted, since many are conducted confidentially on behalf of companies. This confidentiality is sometimes criticized as running counter to rights-based principles of transparency and accountability. In this regard, Nevsun's approach to publishing the assessment and engaging with various stakeholders about its findings and recommendations is commendable, and I hope it represents a good precedent for responsible business conduct for the Canadian extractive industry. While there is a growing interest in HRIAs, I acknowledge that they are sometimes controversial and challenging. Nonetheless, the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights has provided a strong impetus for impact assessments as part of a broader process for human rights due diligence required for companies to demonstrate their respect for human rights. In terms of my background in conducting these studies, I've had the opportunity to work on human rights impact assessments over the past decade from very early days of this field. Initially, I participated in the development of the methodology for community-based human rights impact assessments at Rights and Democracy, and oversaw 5 initial case studies in an in-house counsel role. Since then, I have worked on HRIAs of mining, oil, and gas projects in Peru, Guatemala, Bolivia, the Philippines, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United States, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. I've also worked with the United Nations with a team of experts to prepare a publication about human rights impact assessments of trade agreements in the Pacific region, and I am currently working for the World Bank on a project to gather case studies and lessons learned about impact assessments and human rights due diligence for public and private sector projects. I have collaborated on human rights impact assessments with companies, with investors, governments, multilateral organizations, NGOs, and in Indigenous peoples. And I've seen the opportunities and challenges of using these tools for capacity building, monitoring, evaluation, and building dialogue about human rights from different sides of the complex dynamics that surround large-scale extractive projects. In terms of the approach and methodology for the BISHA assessment, the approach taken was to do a comprehensive assessment of potential human rights impacts. In other words, the full spectrum of human rights was screened and reviewed rather than concentrating on a limited number of human rights issues that had been raised in past allegations. Furthermore, in the research and information gathering stages, I adopted a capacity building approach to explain the relevance of human rights standards to affected stakeholders in Eritrea while I was engaging with them. In other words, I didn't approach my work exclusively as an auditor, but also felt that it was important to help build a foundation for dialogue about human rights on the ground. In terms of the tools used for the assessment, I primarily used the elements from the Danish Institute for Human Rights and Rights and Democracy's tools to structure the different steps of the assessment and to develop customized questions and indicators about specific categories of human rights issues. Most importantly, I was able to undertake 2 field missions to Eritrea. I know that it has been rare for human rights observers to have direct access to Eritrea, and therefore this access has given me a heightened sense of responsibility to ensure that the assessment contributes to constructive dialogue and positive actions about human rights at the Bisha mine. On both my visits, this past September and January, I spent approximately 10 days divided between Asmara and the Bisha mine site, and I undertook the following activities. I conducted interviews with Eritrean stakeholders, including workers, community leaders, managers, government officials, national-level unions, lawyers, and labor tribunal judges. The interviews with workers included confidential individual interviews and focus groups with male and female employees. I conducted site visits to various areas of the Bisha mine, the Bisha camp, and the camp of the subcontractor Segan Construction. I conducted formal and informal interviews with workers during those site visits. I conducted a review of all the relevant policies, management systems, and internal reports and records at Bisha and in the BMSC headquarters in Asmara. I reviewed the contracts that BMSC has entered into with the Eritrean government and various contractors and subcontractors. I interviewed relevant managers about the compliance procedures in place to respect these contractual provisions. Given the past allegations about the Bisha mine, I paid particular attention to reviewing and spot checking the screening procedures in place to safeguard against the use of National Service Program workers. I also conducted interviews and reviewed documents and employment files at Segan's headquarters in Asmara. Throughout the assessment, I experienced cooperation from senior management at Nevsun, BMSC, and ANAMCO, as well as various Eritrean government officials and judges in the Eritrean labor tribunals. I also, at the same time, I felt that I was at liberty to plan my site visits and conduct private and confidential interviews without interference. While my investigation was focused on the Bisha mine, of course I extensively reviewed the international reports about the human rights situation in Eritrea, including with respect to the recent Universal Periodic Review in February 2014 when Eritrea's national human rights record was examined by the UN Human Rights Council. Finally, as you will see from my report, I have extensively relied upon the UN guiding principles on business and human rights for framing the assessment. Obviously, these UN guiding principles are the relevant global standard for business and human rights. However, I find them particularly useful because they emphasize a procedural approach to ongoing human rights due diligence. Whereas my assessment represents a snapshot of various human rights issues in time, it is intended to contribute to the development of the policies, management systems, and grievance mechanisms that are needed for NEVSUN to respect human rights on an ongoing basis and in accordance with UN guiding principles. As I mentioned before, in terms of the specific findings in the report, I'll leave that to the question period. And I'd just like to give a few concluding observations about this particular assessment. First, there are some differences between external reports and what I was able to observe on the ground. Frankly, I expected a more militarized and overtly repressive environment than I witnessed in Asmara and at the mine site. I acknowledge that my investigation did not delve into some of the complex civil and political rights issues that are reported about Eritrea. But my first and second impressions of the country, and particularly the mine site, do not concord with the characterization of Eritrea as the North Korea of Africa. Second, an overarching theme of my conversations with all Eritrean stakeholders is that the Bisha mine is serving as an important precedent for mining in Eritrea. Even in casual conversations on the street of Asmara, people are aware of and interested in Bisha's activities. Furthermore, the development of the overall mining sector in Eritrea is well reported, and I had the opportunity to attend the Asmara Mining Conference during my first visit. I was able to see the domestic and international interest in developing the country's resource wealth. Therefore, this broader context reinforced in my mind the importance of using a capacity-building approach to increase awareness of Eritrean officials, managers, and workers about business and human rights, and to identify opportunities for leverage and dialogue for the development of the overall mining sector. Thirdly, there were clearly sensitivities of the Eritrean government about framing the assessment in terms of international human rights standards that they believe have been politicized. Without detracting from the importance of those standards, it was often much more productive and constructive to have conversations about underlying principles such as respect, equality, freedom, and fairness. Moreover, in my report, I have tried to link these international standards to national legislation and the policies in place at the Bisha mine to provide reference points for local actors. Fourth, as in many backwards-facing assessments, there is always a challenge of adequately assessing allegations from the past. Put it bluntly, I don't have a time machine, nor do I have the powers of a judicial inquiry to compel witnesses and evidence. The inability to make a definitive finding about some of the past allegations about the Bisha mine emphasized for me the importance of ongoing work by NEVSUN and its business partners to strengthen credible and effective grievance mechanisms. These mechanisms can play a vital complementary role to a human rights impact assessment and provide a channel for concerns that I wasn't able to uncover to come forward. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think that NEVSUN's approach to transparency about the assessment and its engagement with stakeholders about the report's recommendations and a follow-up action plan should be commended. Many Canadian mining companies do not conduct human rights assessments, and there is no legal requirement for them to do so. Of those that have, many have not published their reports for various reasons. Therefore, NEVSUN's voluntary transparency is a positive example and provides the context for my appearance today and our ability to have a conversation about human rights at the Bisha mine. And with your permission, I will turn the floor to Mr. Romain.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Romain. I'm the Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility for NEVSUN Resources, which is a Vancouver-based Canadian mining company. As part of our evolving CSR program, NEVSUN Resources decided it was important to undertake an extensive external assessment on how the Bisha mine compares both in a national and international context in respect of human rights of our workforce. This was primarily precipitated by our company's broader understanding of how human rights fits into our expanding CSR program, as well as to address historic stakeholder concerns. The idea behind the specific human rights impact assessment was that of Nevson Resources, but we received the full cooperation and support from the government of Eritrea. To our understanding, this was the first ever human rights impact assessment ever undertaken in Eritrea. Both Nevson Resources and the government of Eritrea decided early on, before the release of the report and its findings, that we were committed to transparency with our stakeholders. This was based on both the idea of putting everything on the table and to address any outstanding issues, as well as our confidence back then that everything that we had done to date would meet positive standards. To date, we have met with various numerous stakeholders face-to-face to discuss the findings of this report and to gather input and suggestive next steps to ensure that the Bishop Mine and its governance model continues to evolve. These meetings have included numerous NGOs, including Mining Watch, Amnesty International, UNICEF, as well as a planned meeting with Human Rights Watch in New York in July. We've also met with the Government of Canada, institutional investors, ethical investor funds, human rights lawyers, as well as a planned meeting with the UN in July. Some, if not all, the suggestions made by our stakeholders, in addition to what has been recommended in the report, will be discussed internally at Nevson and with the Government of Eritrea for implementation. We are, as a company, committed to ongoing transparency with respect to the implementation on these various selected measures and will be in constant dialogue with our stakeholder population by providing written updates to the progress that we make in these on our website and through our CSR reporting exercise. Nevson Resource inherently believes that CSR is a key corporate strategy that is critical in maintaining our social license to operate in Eritrea. Our success as a Canadian mining company relies on the value-add contribution we provide to the people of Eritrea throughout the life of the project. Our business model is relatively unique to Africa, one in which a local national government owns a considerable stake in the business as a mechanism to ensure its citizens are direct beneficial recipients of the extractive industry in terms of local employment, training, supply chain, taxation, and royalties. The decisions affecting the Bishop Mine are that of collaborative consensus, of which our Canadian mining company has had influence to pursue numerous CSR objectives that adhere to both the national laws of the country as well as meet evolving international standards that the Government of Canada recognizes and endorses. The resultant outcome of our partnership has been a successful template for which the Eritreans can apply to other mining companies down the road or to other sectors in their expanding economy. Nevson Resources is committed to ongoing constructive dialogue with our various stakeholders to ensure that the ongoing development of one of the highest grade mineral deposits on the planet is done so in a way that maximizes local capacity, job opportunities, various benefits, while minimizing externalities and contributing in a positive, holistic manner to Eritrean society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, what we're going to do is have 6-minute question and answer rounds. We begin with Mr. Sweet. I'm sorry, we begin with Ms. Graywall. My apologies.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today for your time and your presentations. Well, my question goes to Mr. Romain. Mr. Romain, Nevson's willingness to investigate their corporate social responsibility is undoubtedly an important step that should be really commended. Given Nevson's important economic role in that region, so how do you believe that Nevson can use their commitment to social responsibility and human rights to make a positive impact on the communities around them?
Nevson Resources believes that we have a very expansive CSR program. We provide jobs, we provide training for local people, we have a robust environmental management program, we have an unbelievable record for our health and safety program. Yesterday we reached 1,000 days at the mine site without a lost time injury, which is commendable considering that this is the first industrial type mine site in the country. We have good relationships with our stakeholders. We have numerous grievance mechanisms in place there to allow the public to come forward and air their grievances and for quick resolution. We believe that we have committed ourselves to an effective template to how to run an extractive industry collaboratively with the Government of Eritrea and we believe that this will be used as a precedent for future activities in the country.
NAVSEN ensures that its workers, they are discharged from Eritrea's national service program. And so, however, what about the workers' family members? Are these family members safe from retaliation or kind of punishment from the Eritrean government as well?
I can't comment on that specific question, but what I can say is that we have a very robust and evolving screening process, and we believe that it is effective in maintaining that all workers at our Bishop mine site, whether they be contractors, subcontractors, are free of military service. There is an extensive screening process that ensures that all prospective employers must prove that they are in fact cleared from military service. This information is then verified with the government in Asmara there, and Lloyd Lipset, part of his research was undertaken to double check the authenticity of the process to ensure that all workers there are free at their own will.
Prospective employers, I think you meant all prospective employees.
Sorry, Scott, can you clarify that?
Yeah, did you mean all prospective employees are cleared? Because you said all prospective employers.
All prospective employees are cleared of military service.
The issue of human rights in Eritrea, it's of course a very delicate issue. However, the government of Canada, the UN, and other various human rights organizations are deeply concerned about the testimony and findings that have emerged. So what do you believe is the most effective manner in which Canada can engage with the Eritrean government on this matter?
We believe that the Bishop mine and Canadian mining companies such as NAVSEN is making a positive impact on the country. We cannot speak on the comments made by others with respect to the state of Eritrea, but our experience since the late 1990s has been very positive. We have seen a world-class operation being developed in partnership with the government of Eritrea. We see high levels of local employment. We see considerable taxation revenue being provided to the government, which then in turn use that for community infrastructure and development of the country. We see that the mine site is positively received by the population. So we do believe, from a Canadian context, that we're adding value with respect to relationships between Canada and Eritrea.
And Mr. Lipset, in your presentation, you mentioned that there appeared to be some sort of differences between the external reports and what you observed in Eritrea. So can you please expand upon what these differences are?
As I mentioned, I had read many of these reports before going to Eritrea, and I expected to see more overt repression, as you see in other one-party states. And I didn't see that, and the people that I spoke to, both formally and informally, did not observe the traits of people that were fearful. However, I will acknowledge that I have only been there twice, and I was very focused on the issues pertaining to the Bishop mine. I wasn't, for example, doing, investigation of prison conditions or places where some of the allegations that are quite serious are made. So I have to admit that my view of Eritrea is partial. But it was a significant backdrop, all these important reports that have been made by various organizations and the United Nations. I left after the first time with a sense of perplexity. I was, has the wool been pulled over my eyes? Have I been asking the wrong questions? Have I been talking to the wrong people? And it was important for me to go back a second time and approach these issues from different angles, to deepen conversations with certain individuals or groups, and to try and expand my understanding of the situation. And I came away again with a sense that the level of openness of people to speak with me about issues, they have a nuance on their understanding of the political situation in there that is maybe not in some of the reports. And so I came away with something. There are two stories, and there's a middle narrative. But once again, I do stress that my investigation was focused on the issues pertaining directly to Bisha and not the broader human rights issues that are sometimes raised.
Chair, do I have some more time
I'm
left?
afraid not. You are exactly 6 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Marston, please.
Well, gentlemen, I wasn't expecting to be surprised here today. When Cliff Davis spoke to us, the CEO of Nefson, by teleconference, we came away, or at least I came away from that particular testimony, believe me, had no familiarity at all with UN responsibilities, that he couldn't state clearly whether the company had not ever used forced labor. Now, it might be perhaps we didn't ask the right questions. Irrespective of that, this is a significant move forward, and the company deserves to be commended publicly for that. As the critic for international human rights for the official opposition, I have people from many different nations come before me, Indigenous people, talking about how the pressures that are put on them by their own government, and that the Canadian, they see complicity, whether it's there or not, by Canadian companies. Seeing that Nefson is functioning within the context of its workplace in conformity to a reasonable conformity is exceptionally good news to hear here. But, you know, the obvious question is what's next? And there is a disparity here, and I think your second trip was probably well worthwhile, because there's a disparity here between the kinds of testimony we hear about life on the ground in this country. But we as Canadians would always want our companies, you know, the corporate social responsibility that we expect them here, we expect in any country. And there's been a resistance to that before. And Mr. Romain, I'm pleased that you're working with this company as well. If in the end there's a message passed on to this government, because we're still hearing some pretty horrendous things about it. Do you think that the surprising part for me is the access that you talked about to people? And obviously the first time you were resistant to that, or so you've come away from that actually feeling that that was relatively wide open?
Yeah, I do. I really was able on both occasions to say these are the groups of people that I wanted to speak with, and that included government officials. Obviously within the mine site, it's easy to have access through the company to their managers, but also in terms of dealing with employees, I was able to pick with whom I spoke. In some cases for focus groups, I did that at random. I would take a roster and just tick, 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 person A, person B, and so on. Then with the thorny issue that has come up before is with the subcontractors. I was able to have access to Sagan construction workers at their camp. I was able to freely visit the living quarters and so on and examine those. A relatively small workforce was at the site at the time I was there. They were working on finishing some sort of industrial processes for the copper phase, and I went and inspected their working conditions. There's been issues raised about personal protective equipment, etc., and I was able to speak with them both formally and informally. And using that information that I gathered from them, I went back to the headquarters in Asmara, interviewed the managers, the general managers of Sagan, and then did spot checks of those employees' files in Asmara to make sure the paperwork was in order in accordance with the screening procedure that has been put in place. And I felt in those meetings that I had a good, constructive, open dialogue. I also met, because the issue of national service workers was raised squarely with the construction company. However, there are other contractors that engage with the Bisha mine, and currently my estimation was that now that the construction phase for the copper phase, there's a limited role for Sagan Construction until down the future they might undertake other construction activities. But the main thing is with copper, they have a big truck hauling of the concentrate to the port. And so there's the company called Transhorn Trucking, which will be having, and it's again a state-owned enterprise. And so I went and met with those people, and again the same sort of screening process is being put into place, and so on. So I mean, your question was about access, and I felt I had reasonable access with people, and that was not controlled.
I have a simple question for Mr. Romaine. Nevson voluntarily discloses payments that it makes to this government, and of course, with some other Canadian companies, and we won't point fingers here, there's always been accusations of bribery and that. So I'll give you the opportunity to respond. This is full disclosure that there's no other payments made to this government that are not disclosed.
We provide full disclosure through our CSR reporting exercise, which is an annual exercise, on all the payments that we make to the government of Eritrea.
Well, this human rights assessment that you've done, I suppose is going to take some time for the company to absorb your recommendations. Do you feel at this point that you've got a good ear, that they're actually taking into account, and that they're, because again, it is so hard sitting here with the tremendous accusations of other abuses, and hopefully that all of the Canadian companies will function as they should do. But what those areas found that were lacking, you believe that the company is taking it to heart?
Yeah, I do. And also at the end of my last mission, I also had a chance to speak with the government of Eritrea people, and in very general, broad strokes, painted out some of the areas that I intended to address, and they seemed open. Obviously, Mr. Romaine can speak more to their intention around the follow-up, but I've been very encouraged, and this trip to Ottawa is one part, but we've been in London together, and I know that these are contested issues, that there are different perspectives on it. So I don't want to wave this report and say I've some magic bullet, but here's my best estimation of a good.
Sir, that this occurred is very important.
And just to complete my thought is that the engagement with stakeholders around the recommendations gets to sort of validate from different perspectives. Are these hitting the mark? Can they be supplemented? And I think the commitment that Nevson has made to dialogue and also to publicly disclose a follow-up plan gives a measure of accountability on these issues.
Thank you. We got an extra minute and a half there. I'm not sure who's next. Is it Mr. Sweet or Mr. Schellenberger? Mr. Sweet, okay.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. Mr. Romaine, as the Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility, how often do you visit the Bisha site, and what is the duration of your visits?
On average, I would say that I go to Eritrea 5 times a year, 10 days at a time.
Do you have a direct report that's there on the ground, a manager of corporate social responsibility that reports directly to you?
I deal with various different departmental managers. For example, the environment manager, the health and safety manager, the security manager, the general manager, and so on.
Good. Mr. Lipset, what kind of, you mentioned in your remarks that these assessments are an emerging item. So what is it that, to protect your own reputation, what kind of contractual arrangement do you have when you enter into an agreement like with Nevson, that your human rights report is going to be totally objective, so that, because obviously there's an exchange of consideration here. Is there something in the contractual arrangement at the outset so you make aware that what you see is what you're going to report?
Yes. Two remarks on that, because it is a very valid question, and in the absence of some sort of global mechanism that would fund this work so it could be completely independent and neutral, you come up against this. And I get the same sorts of questions when I work with community groups or Indigenous peoples. It's, there's always a tendency to think if you're paid for by one side or the other, you will be kind of I used to be a litigation lawyer, so you'll be kind of on their pit bull.
She asked those questions.
But The way that there are two things that you can do to try and preserve your independence and, as you mentioned, your reputation. One is by using internationally recognized methodologies, and that in the contractual arrangement and discussion we had was very clear that I would follow this methodology, and I expected to be able to go to the country and have free access, etc. So that's one thing. And then the second element is around the transparency of the report, because that allows the public at large or interested stakeholders to see, was this, make their own assessment of the assessment. And I think in the absence of an independent body that will fund these, that's about as best you can do.
And that may emerge in the days ahead as these become more popular.
Yeah.
You made a very powerful statement. I mean, very powerful in respect to the large binder I have here with testimony that is substantially different, and you've alluded to that about what you expected to see on the ground. So on page 27, you said the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining are protected by the Eritrean Labor Proclamation, and these rights can and have been exercised, as is evidenced by the collective agreements in place for a number of BMSCs, suppliers, contractors, and subcontractors. So you saw evidence that the unionized activity was happening there and respected, and these collective agreements were actually supported by legislation of the Eritrean government?
Yeah, indeed I did. I actually had obtained a copy of the Sagan Construction Company's collective agreement, and it was in the local language and had it translated, and I've read through the 60-odd articles of that collective agreement and had extensive conversations with both the Sagan management about how they are implementing that collective agreement, as well as with labor tribunal officials, to whom sometimes if an issue cannot be resolved within the collective agreement framework, issues come to the labor tribunal. And most importantly, I also, around the sort of the legislative framework, I had extensive conversations with the Ministry of Labor and Human Welfare about their view on collective agreements in the Eritrean economy.
The sands of time are running out on me, so I wanted to also ask you, can you explain to my colleagues, I think it's important, you mentioned these one-on-one interviews that you had. Could you share with us like the nature of them, particularly with those people who are front line? So these would be the people that in the reports would be the ones that would most likely be subject to conscription, forced labor, and of course extension of their conscription. Give us an idea about how those conversations went and why you thought, and are testifying here today, that they're authentic.
I mean, there are a couple of elements to it. One is the nature of the questions that you pose, and in an interview you will pose sort of similar questions from a number of different ways at different times to ensure there's consistency within it. I try to ask open questions to get someone to explain a story, a narrative, and then we'll follow up with some detailed questions to see if it holds together. When dealing with the frontline people, I don't try to come up as sort of cross-examining someone. I want to try and build a relationship of confidence, and in that sense it's very important to make assurances around the confidentiality, to explain what my role is in terms of providing recommendations to the company and to the government to improve the situation, to try to create a safe environment and context for them to open up. And obviously there's a lot of it is about observing the body language and the demeanor of someone, and whether they appear to be shifty or scared or so on. Some other techniques that are used is to then you do follow-up the second time you come, try and meet with the same person, see if their story holds together 3 months later. But a big part of it is getting enough of a sample size to talk with enough of people to see if the aggregate story kind of adds up or doesn't. The one thing that I will say, and that's an ongoing matter of discussion, is we know that there are people that have made allegations about Bisha Mine that are likely outside of Eritrea. I think they've been in contact with some of the NGOs. I did not have access to these people in my report, but it is a subject of our ongoing discussions. And Mr. Romaine mentioned we'll be meeting with Human Rights Watch in New York later. And there's, I believe, a sincere attempt to reach out to these organizations to see if there are people that I was not able to have access to, how can they facilitate having some manner of bringing a concern forward.
Thank you. I see Mr. Romaine was going to say something.
I just wanted to add to that we do have an expanded whistleblower policy last year that we've developed, which will enable all stakeholders, past, present, and future, to bring forward any kind of confidential, non-financial or financial code of ethic violations, and that would be reviewed confidentially by our Vancouver office.
Thank you, Chair.
Just before we go to Professor Kotler, I just wanted to ask a question. When you interview someone, you explained you have a system for randomizing the list of employees. When you meet with somebody, typically how long would you be meeting or interviewing with them for? How long would your interviews be?
An average interview would be somewhere between half an hour and an hour. Some of the interviews that I would do with group interviews are also another thing. They are less likely to get at very specific individual issues, but they're good at getting sort of a broad understanding of how different groups feel in sort of more of the collective issues. And particularly, doing this work, I always try to have focus groups for female employees who are often in the minority in a mining context. And that's a good way for women to try and surface issues. And those tend to last a bit longer, an hour and a half. Interviews with managers can be quite long, 2 to 3 hours, because I will actually go through their policies, procedures, and so on. And it's often with managers that I will go and inspect different areas of the work site, and so on. Interviews with government officials tend to be about an hour and a half, and with those, the government, particularly the Ministry of Labour and Human Welfare, I had several ones at increasingly high levels.
When you're dealing with somebody at the mine site themselves, someone who is not in a management position but who is an employee, and you're meeting with them individually, who's in the room? Yourself, that person, I'm guessing a translator?
In most cases, it was just myself and the individual or the group. There were some with the local, the more, let's say, low-level local workers that a translator was present. That was one of the community liaison officers. And sometimes, in order to explain context, I would have their manager come and give an introduction of why Mr. Lipset is here and what he's doing, but then that person would leave the room and I would conduct it with no management or governmental presence.
All right, thank you. Professor Kotler, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lipset, my colleague, Mr. Marsden, mentioned the appearance before our committee of Mr. Cliff Davis on November 1st, 2012. And at one point in the course of his appearance, I put to him the question that we have heard witness testimony and references made to this about widespread and systematic human rights violations in Eritrea. UN reports, indeed our own government reports, and those that you are familiar with. I then went on to ask him, do you have any concerns about these human rights violations? Have they been reported to you? Have any of the villagers, any groups reported to you about any human rights violations? Mr. Cliff Davis, no. I then said, no, okay. So you've received no reports of any human rights violations while you have been in Eritrea? Mr. Cliff Davis, no. Therefore, I am pleased, as I think Mr. Marsden himself indicated, and all of us here, about the field missions that you have undertaken and the human rights impact assessment. And indeed, in your testimony today, you made reference to your own acknowledgement of the international reports that we have referenced in our testimony. But you also said that, you know, there are these reports and then there are what you have heard, and these are narratives and truth is somehow in the middle. I'm rather not responsive to narratives. I'm usually more responsive to facts. And so my question is, do you think that all these international reports, of which you are aware and have read and even referenced in your testimony today, are these just narratives, or would you regard them as corroborative statements of witness testimony?
I can't comment on those because I wasn't part of the methodology for those, but I tend to give the UN and such organizations a high deal of deference in terms of their reporting and their methodologies. So I would not sort of a priori dismiss those in any sense. But what I do also note in the UN reports and that the treatment is mostly about the conduct of the state, and the treatment of business responsibility is quite thin in those. I think that will, with future reports, evolve, and there will be more analysis by UN agencies of these now that the UN guiding principles have been adopted and there's more attention on these issues. Certainly, the one report that everyone here will be familiar with is the Human Rights Watch report about the mining sector in Eritrea. I have respect for Human Rights Watch as an organization, and certainly I read that attentively and used some of the concerns there to frame areas of inquiry for my own thing. As in terms of fact, I was not able to establish, because their specific allegations dated back to 2009, I was not able to either to corroborate or not those. And I think I'm quite open about that in the report, and say that for those past factual issues, there need to be grievance mechanisms that are credible and effective, that those can be addressed in an appropriate manner.
Did those whom you met with, let's say, are villagers or groups and the like, did any of them report to you about human rights violations or their acknowledgement of the violations that you shared with them in these reports?
I met with national level stakeholders, I'll be vague about who did talk about concerns around in some cases around the National Service Program. People I spoke with in a general sense about that, their concern didn't seem to be about the existence of the National Service Program per se, but the wanting to have the government respect the 18-month limit on that. In discussions with local workers and villagers and village elders, the issuers were very much around the positive aspects. They really appreciate the jobs. The workers really appreciate both a much higher paying job than is available in other sectors, as well as the skill formation that they're getting. They appeared to be quite proud to be part of something kind of new and modern, and that maybe represents a bit of an opening of the economy. The village elders did make specific requests that they would like to have further dialogue with the company, that they appreciated the engagement through the community liaison officers, and they said that that's something that they expect to have this ongoing dialogue about, both potential negative things, could be, dust from trucks on the road, or also about positive things about having further jobs or programs in their communities.
I'm just wondering, I probably only have time for one more question, and it could be answered by yourself or Mr. Romain together with you, as he's made, by his own acknowledgement, a number of regular visits to Eritrea. My question is, from your own experience and your own encounters there. Do you have any specific recommendations regarding what might be our own particular sort of governmental or parliamentary role or responsibility regarding these issues?
A couple of ideas. I think what NEVSUN has done is, I think, responsive to some of the suggestions that have been made by this committee previously. And so I think, and Mr. Romaine has talked about ongoing reporting on these, so I think keeping a dialogue with NEVSUN about how they follow up on these recommendations. There are also other Canadian companies that are operating in Eritrea, and so maybe there's a conversation to be had with them about their approach. And finally, there's obviously I know that the government CSR policy for the extractive sector is currently under review. In the initial version 5 years ago, they made some passing references to the work of John Ruggie and the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. Now that those have been adopted in the UN Guiding Principles, Canada might consider making more formally those standards as one of the international standards that extractive companies should abide by, which would provide a similar framework that NEVSUN's work on this project has been framed by.
And just to add that we see CSR as a key strategic objective for NEVSUN Resources, and we will continue to work with the Eritrean government inch by inch on expanding our CSR portfolio at the Bishop Mine.
Thank you.
We go to Mr. Schellenberger now.
Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation today. And I'm from southwestern Ontario, and right now we have a big problem. We have a company named Samsung, and we have wind turbine farms that are going in all over the place. And the company has a great relationship with the government, the provincial government, but the local governments have been stripped of all their rights to say whether they would like this to come into their community or not. My thing is with NAVSUN, and you talk about having a great relationship with the Eritrean government, and yes, the workers at the mine are quite pleased, and some of those people that have some of that work are quite pleased. But I can tell you right here in Canada, some of the recourse that comes from that, when some of these places get put, these wind farms get put into place, and people have to leave their homes because they get sick, and the various things that happen. So, could you identify some of the programs that describe positive impact on the Eritrean community? And were some of the groups that you talked to, were they kind of chosen groups, or were you free to go to pretty well anyone, or were there some that were off base?
In terms of the local communities, in my initial trip, I had a meeting with all the leaders from the 5 or 6 villages. So their traditional leader came, and we had a very long and interesting conversation. They talked a lot about the positives of the fact they're members of their villages have employment, and how that's a very positive thing for them. They spoke a little bit, these were male traditional leaders, about the changing roles of women who were now employed in the wage workforce at Bisha. They talked about some, as I mentioned before, their expectation for ongoing dialogue, and I think this gets to your point about sort of these people would kind of represent some sort of local governance, right? And so that they want to feel that they're in dialogue, and they said that they felt that to date there has been an open and back and forth dialogue that has been able to address issues informally, but they want to ensure that that proceeds. And then there's certain requests. I've reflected a few of them in my report around literacy training for adults and so on, to be able to older members of the community to be able to take advantages of job opportunities and so on. So that's the kind of the traditional leadership at the village level. There was also something that I noted in the most recent report of the government of Eritrea to the UN Human Rights Council. They had listed some recent reforms that are going to decentralize decision-making on some regional development activities to what's called the Zorba level, which would be kind of a, I don't know if province is the right analogy, but a subdivision level. And that was something that in my last recommendation to NEVSUN is to continue its dialogue with the government and the sub-regional level about implementation of what they call the Community Assistance Program, which then through a process of dialogue with these people, they could target programs that may provide further benefits to the communities.
Mr. Romay?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges of operating in Eritrea is that the government of Eritrea has a very different view on CSR. They believe that CSR is the responsibility of the state, not of a corporation. And they believe that the benefits of resource extraction should be applied equitably across the country. So therefore, it has been a challenge for us to provide more direct benefits to the communities. That being said, though, we're confident through ongoing negotiation with the government that we will be able to decentralize our CAP funding to the communities. And in addition, with more mines operating in the country, many of them coming from G8 countries, that there will be expectations from shareholders with those companies operating in Eritrea to decentralize some of the benefits to the nearby communities.
Thank you. I'll pass the next question to my colleague.
You got a minute.
Mr. Lipson, if you could entertain me, you had mentioned about a political nuance that was brought up. It sounded like you meant on several occasions, and we've had some other testimony before the committee, most specifically the day before yesterday, and that political nuance was to give the Eritrean government a lot of space as far as human rights are concerned, because they live in a state of alert and constant threat of attack. Is that the kind of nuance that most of them were giving the space to their government regarding?
I just found in discussions that if I led with, say, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights or something, I would get a reaction about how the UN and the agencies that have created these international human rights standards, how they're politicized and how they're dominated by certain great powers that are active in the region and so on and so forth. So quickly, I just found an approach where I started with at the ground up rather than the top down, where I would start with looking at the policies of the Bisha mine, which are quite extensive, and have actual, quite pragmatically and operationally focused, the principles that you would find in the international covenants and the international labor declarations. And so I talk about that because that is something that had been negotiated between the government and NEVSUN. We could really get into a meaty conversation, and we're not getting into, I apologize, abstract conversations about, the politics of the UN. The next level up would be to talk about the national legal framework. In some cases, we know that the Constitution has been suspended, so that's not really on point. But for instance, on many issues, the labor proclamation in Eritrea has things that you could be cut and paste from an international labor declaration, and you could have a very good conversation about that. So when I sit, it's not to at all dismiss the importance of the international declarations as the overall framing of my work, but to have a constructive conversation. I found it easier to start at the references that people were familiar with and accepted at the ground, because then we're not into existential or political conversations, something focused and pragmatic.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Benskin, you'll be our final questioner.
Thank you, and thank you both for being here. I would like to join my colleague in commending the efforts of NEFSUN in taking steps forward into a more transparent atmosphere in the corporate social responsibility. I guess the burning question that I have, and it kind of, I guess, follows on the heels of my my colleague, Mr. Sweet, in terms of testimony that I've heard in the last little while, and how terms like nuance and politicization and so forth keep creeping back into the discussion. And to me, I have to be honest, it does cause me concern, because when we start talking that way, for me, it's not clear. It's not a clear answer. And yes, not all life's answers can be clear, but when we're dealing with people's rights, clarity is something which is paramount. So I guess for me, I would like your opinion on why there's such a discrepancy, for lack of a better way of putting it, between what you experienced on the ground in your visits and the various reports from other outside agencies. And I guess part B of that question is would be, why do they have such difficulty in getting kind of access that you got, that would, if this is true, if those states, if those conclusions are true, would go a long way into changing the view of these outside agencies?
As a matter of personal opinion, I think that the lack of access to some of these other groups that have, credibility and so on, giving more access would probably do the country of Eritrea, not necessarily the government, but the country, a service, in the sense that a more additional people seeing with their own eyes would create perhaps more of a less contested view of what the situation is on the ground. And I hope that the precedent that has been set through this will in some way open the door and maybe create a bit of comfort that the sky is not going to fall if you let in a human rights expert into the country. From my general understanding, and this hasn't been pursued in depth, but the UN agencies have been encouraged by a step made by the government of Eritrea to re-enter into negotiations with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on human rights capacity building, which would probably give access to them, and they would be obviously a very credible organization to work with the government and to do monitoring activities. So I hope that that goes forward. In terms of my own personal view and trying to ensure that I, as I said before, didn't have the wool pulled over my eyes, it's continuing the engagement with some of the NGO groups that do claim to be in contact with some people that may have escaped the country or left the country voluntarily. And it's, because you said it's important on matters of rights to have clarity, I think what I'm dealing with is issues in a fairly broad sense. I wasn't dealing with any specific cases. Those would be most appropriately dealt with through some forum for access to remedy, whether it be the company's own grievance mechanisms or some other external mechanism. Here in Canada, we have a number of outwards-facing mechanisms for complaints to be brought forward about Canadian companies. So that's where I think it would be most appropriate to get to the very clarity and truth around specific allegations or concerns. And then I guess finally, I just hope that there is more access, and then this, either I will be confirmed or contradicted in what I was able to observe.
Mr. Romain, just and hope the chair will give me a little latitude. You were talking about the decentralization of some of the activities or decision-making processes to be able to have more of a direct effect on the communities around your area. And I think, I'm sure, I can't remember which one of you spoke to things like literacy projects and that type of thing. What kind, if any, of work is being done by NEVSUN to bring up and educate and train the next generation of Eritreans to participate at a higher level in the functioning of NEVSUN, so that the work that's being done again benefits them in more than just a worker aspect, but in a decision-making aspect as well.
We have ongoing dialogue with the government of Eritrea on that of localization. It's a key objective for the government. It's a key objective of NEVSUN to ensure that we maximize local employment opportunities as well as provide pertinent training to give skill sets so Eritreans can receive greater levels of responsibility and pay in the mining sector. On site at the Bishop Mine, we have an extensive training center there where we put through hundreds of Eritreans annually through various different training programs there. Many of these individuals don't even have CVs or any practical vocational experience, so we were actually training them on site there, providing them letters of authenticity to say that they've completed Program A or Program B, and that enables them to grow within the Bishop Mine or to work in other sectors within the mining industry in Eritrea. Currently, as it stands, 91% of our workforce is Eritrean, which is quite a considerable feat considering this is the first modern mining industry in the country. 42% of our senior management team now is Eritrean, and we will continue to increase those numbers. And we see training as a key component to the benefit that NEVSUN Resources and the government of Eritrea can bring to the country.
Thank you. And do we stop?
Actually, you're out of time. You're over time, actually. We're going to have to turn in a second to another matter, a few motions. But before we do that, I just have one final question. This is for Mr. Lipset. You made reference to, you used a phrase, capacity building approach. Could you just define that for us?
In the emerging literature, there's a sort of growing discussion around what are some of the objectives or benefits of these particular tools. And one of the ones that is recurring is about the ability of these processes to inform the rights holders, so the workers or the community members, about what their rights are and what they mean. And so in my report, I recommend further human rights training for employees and so on. I try to do a bit of that as I approach it, just to give people a sense of what that framework is, that in addition to these local policies that are in place, these reflect standards that, and also I think in educating people around this quite new, these guiding principles on business and human rights, and how the government has a certain set of obligations and companies have a certain set of responsibilities and so on, to give them a context for my work. And as I think I mentioned, it's in the hope that if there's going to be follow-up to this, that relevant managers, employees will be able to contextualize their role as an environment manager or a security department person and how that is fitting into a bigger picture of human rights respect and protection.
Thank you. To our witnesses, we're going to excuse you. You don't have to leave, but we're going to just move on to some other items of business. So you have our thanks for having come here and provided us with your testimony. Colleagues, for the committee members, we have 3 motions that were put before us, and there have been some discussions. Just ask the question, is there any of them that does not have consensus at this point?
Chair.
Can we deal with the 2 quickly then?
Yeah, Mr. Marston's motion regarding Vietnam, I think we have agreement all the way through.
He's saying that we've got consensus on your motion.
Yeah, the only issue is that I added the Viet Tan to it. He's aware of that.
Okay, the version the clerk needs to. Can you read the version you've got there, Mr.?
That the Subcommittee on International Human Rights invite back those witnesses from the 29th of May 2014 meeting studying Vietnam, human rights situation in Vietnam, so that they can complete their testimony. And I had added that, and in addition, add the Viet Tan. And Mr. Sweet was in agreement with that.
And everybody else is too?
Agreed.
Okay, that one's done. Let's go to the other one. Professor Kotler, one of yours has consensus. Let's deal with that one.
Yes, we have consent for one of the motions. That is the one regarding the third annual Iran Accountability Week on the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran. On that one, there is consensus.
Okay. Okay, we've got consensus, so that's adopted. Now let's turn to the other one then.
The second one with regard to Camp Liberty, there is mostly but not yet complete consensus, and we will take it up at the next meeting on next Tuesday.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thanks for being so patient with this. Thanks for being gracious about the fact that I had to cut some of you off when you had productive lines of questioning. There's a certain unfairness to the way that works, but I appreciate your generosity of spirit as always. We are adjourned.